Hi, my name is Rhys Whittington and this is my final FMP presentation. This presentation will cover my original project proposal and my rationale, my inspirations for the project, key asset lists and the early preparation, timeline and scheduling for the project, various stages of production to the final product, and finally a reflection on the entire assignment. For my original project proposal, I wanted to create a roguelike which focused on exciting combat and random generated environments. The main elements required for this project would be a demo environment where the player is introduced to the mechanics and can experience the combat in a controlled manner. Multiple items that the player could pick up throughout their level which would change how they fought and the properties of their combat. Multiple enemies for the players to interact with to truly experience and test this combat, as well as a procedurally generated dungeon which used art assets created by me. I chose to develop this project because the framework of the roguelike genre allows me to focus wholly on gameplay design and a lot less on level design, allowing me to go further with enemy designs, gameplay, mechanics, power-ups, and anything that would impact the gameplay rawly without having to worry about necessarily the level design that comes with that, and really leaning into the random generation and the variety that comes with that. My inspirations for the project includes other roguelikes such as The Binding of Isaac, Hades, and Enter the Gungeon. My original feature list was small and I split it into stages, with stage 1 having to be completed before items in stage 2, and then finally any wishlist features that I would love to have had for my game, but ultimately weren't the priority of what I was producing. With it being more gameplay focused, I chose to have a minimum of 3 weapon power-ups, obviously a player controller that could actually do the combat, camera controller along with basic level generation, player health system, respawning, and some enemies, just anything that would fully simulate what the actual combat of a final product could be. Here are the 3 initial concepts for my power-ups and what they would do to the player combat and how they would affect their projectile. Management tools were a huge part of my success with my FMP. I used a Trello board to help me keep track of all my features on a week-by-week basis, and I used Gantt charts to split my development into phases. The first phase included a relatively simple list where all of my features that I deemed as necessary would be developed by the end of December, with any features that came after that being developed after that point. The first thing I developed for the project was the procedural generation. I knew that if I couldn't get this done, then I couldn't do the project because it would no longer be a roguelike without the procedural generation element. This system works by having spawn points leading from open doorways which have an integer assigned to them. This integer would be related to a specific direction, and that direction would choose from a list of rooms that would fulfill that requirement. If there was an empty door leading up, it would have to spawn a room with a door that led down to connect to it. So when the spawn action would be called, it would choose from a list of rooms with doors at the bottom. And then this cycle would continue when an open door would be present in the new room. These rooms were stored in an object called room templates, which would keep lists of each the possible room types. So it'd have bottom rooms, top rooms, left rooms, right rooms, etc. And these were all stored as prefab objects. Next I moved on to creating the basic player controller, complete with an attached camera, moving and shooting. I created a demo scene where I could test weapon pickups and their effectiveness on enemies. First one is the bouncy bullet, which I test against the white square, and the second is the grenade, which I test against the green square. I then went on to test enemy functionality, with the white square being a turret and the green being a sort of pursuer enemy that damages you on contact. Of course, part of this system is developing all of the health, with the UI that you can see in the top left being very early in development and placeholder, and a small health pickup that will restore 1 heart when you get damaged, and a death screen so you can respawn. With the player controller and enemies now working to a degree, I went forward and added them as part of the generation system, with each room containing an enemy spawner that would choose from a selection of enemy groups which were, like the rooms themselves, stored as prefabs. As development continued, I realised that movement was also a very big part of the game, so I created a dash mechanic. This works by accelerating your movement in whichever direction that you choose for a couple of seconds once the spacebar is pressed. One of the final components I wanted for the rooms are doors that would teleport you into the next room that you're looking to enter. These doors would also have the functionality of locking when it contains enemies, but as you can see by the flashing, that wasn't currently working at this point. The feedback I received for Phase 1 included the game being too easy, with certain AIs being very predictable and you being able to see into the rooms you wanted to go into. This resulted in players not feeling very challenged by the experience. The particles for when a bullet would be destroyed were massive and did not fit the aesthetic of the game. It was difficult to track both the players and the HUD elements at the same time. The grenade was awfully weak and was not worth picking up. People would actually vouch for leaving it on the floor. The doors did not function. They wouldn't lock players in rooms properly. Something I wasn't expecting, where you could actually get lost because all of the rooms look so similar. With this feedback in mind, I created my second Gantt chart for Phase 2 development. This split my game into updates which would tackle different issues that were brought up in the feedback. The baseline update would be to fix any bugs with the generation, visual issues, adding a new camera, getting a minimap in there is something that people requested and wanted, as well as adjusting the room size for a new camera mechanic. Then it would be a presentation update, which would feature more of the visual side of it, fixing my visual aesthetic for the particles, the rooms, actually having the doors describe whether they were locked or unlocked and not just being a different color. The next update would be focused around balance, where I would submit it for player feedback and they would comment on item or enemy balance, as well as their general thoughts of the game, which would then move on to me adding the final weapon type, any extra enemies, boss to complete the game loop, reward systems, and the item combinations. Finally, the refinement period would be just time for me to really refine those features based on the feedback that I had received and get it ready for the final presentation. At the start of Phase 2, I made the rooms the same size as the player screen and used cinemachines to lock the player perspective in the current room that they were in. The minimap in the top left would display a room that the player had been in so they could use it to easily navigate the level. Pickups could now spawn when a room was cleared of enemies, but this only had a chance to spawn. This included a health and the new overshield mechanic, which will protect you from one hit of damage. These items, the power-ups, and the boss are all trackable on the minimap. One of the largest changes I made in Phase 2 was to move all the HUD elements and have them as part of the player, allowing the player to remain focused on where their character was while still keeping all that key information accessible. Part of this change is the new bullet counter, which is a restriction I chose to add because of the player power and the game being too easy. Having a bullet counter means that people have a few seconds where they can't fight anything and are forced to evade and think about where they want to place their bullets and like what enemies they'd rather kill in a given situation. The clip size also allows me to balance all of the weapons individually instead of having them all be the same clip size. Some might be more powerful, like the grenade, so the clip size will be smaller, and others, like the bouncy bullets, will have a bigger clip size because the fun and uniqueness of that ability comes from having lots of projectile power. The turret enemies now rotate, which makes them significantly harder to fight, which was a great balance change for those. And one of the final elements added was indeed the boss room. The boss will always spawn in the last room generated, so they will always be furthest away from the player. And it comes with a health bar which displays at the top of the screen, and once killed, a escape hatch will spawn below where the boss is. This game still had some bugs at this point, where rooms could generate into void areas, and green enemies could detect you through walls and thus would be waiting for you at the doorway making avoiding them impossible, and that was a huge frustration from players. At this point in the project, I'd put out a huge Google form for people to play my game and to test it out and give me lots of feedback for it, where I gathered some very good suggestions, as well as some bugs that people had found for me to fix. The main feedback that was gathered were that people were having trouble keeping track of the cursor because the background of the game was white and I didn't have a custom reticle or a custom cursor. Enemies would detect the player through walls and then damage upon room entry, which is what I demonstrated earlier. Players did want feedback on enemy health so they could tell when an enemy was about to die. People hated the new enemy, which was the red square, which functioned just like the green enemy but with twice the amount of health, so you could not kill it in a single clip. Some doors would generate incorrectly and not close off properly, so you could go through into void areas. The grenade power-up had a knockback aspect to it, which you could use to knock the boss out of the final level, and then making the escape hatch inaccessible. And finally, there was some feedback based on the sprites used for items also being squares, which is what the enemies were, so that would also need some changing. The plans to fix these issues included just some general bug fixes to the level generation to stop the doors generating incorrectly, to freeze enemy behaviors before the player enters the room. This would, one, allow me to remove the radiuses from the green enemies to make it so that if you're in a room, they will just run at you, but also removing the problem where they would wait at you if they detected you through a wall, so they would wait at the doorway. Balance the red enemy to be less frustrating by reducing its speed, so you still have to think about it, but it is not a super oppressive threat that you can't deal with. I also wanted to adjust the textures of the game because I knew these weren't the finalized looks for it, the aesthetic, and I would also use this to increase cursor visibility. At this point in the project, I still had some final additions to make, as we're in March, and in about a month or so we would be nearing the deadline. I listed out the key things that were still missing from my original proposal, plus anything else I thought I could do. That list ended up being a main menu, a complete tutorial section, a lobby that you can use to either access the player levels for the random generation or the tutorial, the third power-up, and a new enemy type. I worked tirelessly over the course of March and April to get the game as good as possible with all of the features I had listed, including complete overhaul to how a load of the graphics were displayed in the environment, all of the enemy changes that I wanted to, including all the balances and everything in that category, all of the item icon clarities. Every pickup had its unique sprite now. The doors now communicated with lights to state whether they were open or closed, which worked a lot better. I added a new enemy. Its dev name is the Beehive, but the idea of it is that it shoots out little minions that come and attack you, and if you damage it, it becomes agitated and it will fire them out quicker, so you've got sort of agency to deal with it. The final power-up, which was the other huge thing I decided to add, obviously being in the original criteria, was a laser beam, which is very different to the rock concept. I realized through playing with just the bouncy bullet and the grenade that just the concept of the heavy bullet that I had drawn up just wouldn't fit in the game. So instead I approached it by using raycasts to create a laser beam weapon, which would function as instantaneous damage, which nothing else in the game could do. Along with the introduction of the laser beam weapon, I added a pop-up which would display the name of the pickup that would change your weapon, and a very brief descriptor as to how it would change your weapon, so that new players, when they come across a weapon for the first time, can get a vague idea before they have to use it in combat. I also made sure to build the tutorial completely, which includes these extra prompts that work like the item pickups, but instead they display part of the game and teach the player as they move through preset rooms, so the tutorial isn't randomly generated. It even includes an area at the end of the tutorial which will allow players to trial and error certain rooms with hostile enemies that will try to kill them, so they do get a very good idea of what the actual game flow looks like. The final thing I implemented into my FMP was sound, something that I was not expecting to implement. The sounds I used are from online and they're from royalty free, so they weren't made by me, but I had to create a audio manager that would basically play the sounds whenever it was called from a certain item or interaction, and I'm very glad I did it. It makes all the shooting and picking up items, it really adds to the experience, so it was definitely worth my time. When reflecting on this project, I felt it was an incredibly successful project, at least in what I set out to do. The project in its bare bones, it didn't have sound planned, it didn't have as many enemies planned. I ended up with 4 enemies, but I'd only really planned for 2. It really was just a really, really successful experience from what I had originally intended to what I ended up producing. I'd pretty much set out to do everything in my rationale and my proposal, and nothing, for the most part, nothing really changed. The only thing that was slightly different at the end was my original proposal had a bit more emphasis on combinations between the power-ups, and although those are in the game, as is evident by the tutorial, there is no current way of getting 2 power-ups to spawn in the same level. That's something that would be much more indicative of the final game experience where you have multiple floors. This will only generate 1 floor for you, and once you get to the end of that floor, defeat that boss. That is it. It will take you back to the main menu. But apart from that, it's a very obvious slice of what could definitely be a much larger game, and because of that, I'm very, very happy with it. It doesn't feel generic. I worried about it maybe feeling generic, but especially the innovations I made with the UI and having all the HUD elements display on the player just made it stand out on its own. If I was to do the project again and I was to do it differently, I would definitely have incorporated multiple levels of the dungeon in my slice so you could see the weapon combos working together. I also would have implemented the boss AI. I would have found a way to do it in this project. I just ran out of time for it. It was a wishlist feature, but the boss itself allowed me to complete the game loop. It's a full demonstration of what the game would be like. The reason I decided not to do the boss AI was because I couldn't guarantee the boss spawning in an appropriate sized room. So if the boss had spawned in like the corridor room, it wouldn't have been possible to do the boss fight because he would have been moving in a place where you couldn't shoot him. So that was the main reason I decided not to do that. But if I was to do the project again, I'd definitely find a way. Future thoughts for my project going forward is that I will definitely continue working on it. I think it's a great project. It has so much potential, and I could grow it into something that is much more complete of a game, and I think it's got good enough foundations for that. I would definitely plan on doing more features for it, environments, bosses, enemies, items, and the glory of doing roguelike is that it's all modular and can be randomized into each other, so the second I add something, it could appear anywhere, and that is just really fun to work with. I'd definitely look at having different room sizes and use Cinemachines to have a camera follow you around is definitely something I'd be interested in doing, and obviously having the multiple floors so I could get the entire game in are all things that I will definitely be working on in the future. But that is everything for my presentation, so I'm going to leave you with a full commentless playthrough, and thank you for listening to my final major project final presentation.